Hello and welcome to this episode of Exit Pursued by the Bard. I think we could call this episode The Bard Pursued by the Plague, because that's what we're going to talk about. My name's John Moss and I'm a relative newcomer to the Canterbury Shakespeare Festival. I'm down to be directing Sir Thomas More, which will now be in 2022, which I'm very excited about. And I'm also very excited to be joined by three new friends from the festival for this discussion. What we're going to be talking about is the fact that we all know that Shakespeare's life and career were both affected by the plague, but we want to probe into that a bit and think about how we think that affects the plays themselves, and indeed, in our current circumstances, whether our experience of the pandemic has changed in any way how we think about Shakespeare and the plague, or indeed about the plays more generally. So I'm very pleased to be joined, as I said, by three people, and I'll just ask them now in turn to introduce themselves to you. So, Charlotte.
Hello to anyone watching or listening. To anyone familiar with the festival, you may recognise me as Charlotte Groombridge, who is the managing director, as well as acting in some plays, as well as directing in some others. Pass it over to Ciarán.
Sorry, just had to clear my throat. Hello. You can cut that. I'm Ciarán. I have been working with CSF for many years now in a writing and acting capacity. I do some other things on the side also, but yeah, I'm happy to be here. This is my second time on the series. Yeah, that's me.
And over to Sarah.
Okay, well, I'm Sarah Lockyer, and I've been associated with the festival for a couple of years now, acting, and I'm looking forward to directing in 2022 as well. I'll be directing Henry IV Part 1. Can't wait to do that. Yes, I've been involved in some of the online things that have been going on with CSF during lockdown and COVID. So delighted to be here and part of this panel. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, friends. And I thought I'd just kick off for the benefit of people who, for whom Shakespeare may be relatively new, with a few of the things that we know or have been suggested are possible about how the plague actually affected Shakespeare and his life. So, I mean, the first fact that we know is that the plague hit Stratford, where Shakespeare was born, only 11 weeks after his birth, and about 200 people died in that outbreak, which was a considerable number for a relatively small town. In his own family, at least two of his siblings died of the plague in infancy. There's a theory also that Shakespeare's theatrical career may have begun because of the plague, because we all wonder how he got to London. And one theory is that a troupe of visiting players came to Stratford when it was impossible to perform in London because of the plague, and that he may have joined a travelling group and got back to London with them, having been excited by theatre through it coming to where he lived. Of course, when he did get there, the theatres in London were very frequently closed. The practice in London tended to be that the theatres got shut at any time when there were more than 30 deaths recorded from the plague in a given week. So you can see something that was operating there a bit like the R number that we've experienced, or the numbers in hospital, or the number of deaths, sadly, in the last year or so. And that meant that there were major closures of the theatres for periods as long as nearly 3 years in 1592 to 4, a really bad outbreak in 1603 when 30,000 people out of 200,000 in London died. And again, other outbreaks in 1606, 1608 to 9. And I've seen one critic has argued that actually the total time the theatres were open during Shakespeare's time in London was not much more than about 78 months, which makes his productivity seem even more remarkable, I think. And the plague is certainly there in his writing, but I think one of the things that feels puzzling in view of the extent of its influence is that he doesn't appear to have written a play specifically dealing with it. There are references to it in many places. Those go back as early as one of his long poems, Venus and Adonis, that he wrote during that first outbreak that I mentioned, in which Venus says that the power of Adonis's kiss could drive away the plague. The plague, she says, is banished by thy breath. And this runs on. Probably the most famous quotation of all about the plague in the whole of Shakespeare is Mercutio's line that he speaks after he's been fatally injured in the famous duel, which is to curse the Capulet and Montague houses with the line, "A plague on both your houses." And if you follow Romeo and Juliet through to the end, you see that in some ways that curse could actually be said to be fulfilled, because the practical reason why things end as tragically as they do is because the Friar John, is unable to deliver the message which might have brought about a happier ending, because he gets locked in a plague house. He says, explaining why he hasn't been able to deliver the message, "The searchers of the town, suspecting that we both were in a house where the infectious pestilence did reign, sealed up the doors and would not let us forth." So it's very specific reference to the plague that Mercutio had called down that has a really significant influence on the final outcome. And there are odd lines like that scattered through many of the plays, including, for example, in Timon of Athens, Timon asking Alcibiades to make sure that he acts in an extremely ruthless manner, says to him, "Be as a planetary plague. When Jove will o'er some high vice city hang his poison in the sick air, let not thy sword skip one." So be as ruthless and relentless in the plague in killing the people who Timon wants to see killed. So there are lines like that all over the place, but none of those amount to a kind of systematic presence that is particularly obvious. But what my friends have been doing is thinking about whether you can find something more coherent or systematic that in some way relates to the play in particular plays that they're interested in. And we're now going to talk about those plays in turn in a bit more depth. And Charlotte is going to start off by talking to us a bit about King Lear. So thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you, John. So I chose King Lear initially because that was the big thing that was going round at the beginning of the first lockdown, was when Shakespeare was in quarantine, he wrote King Lear. And we're unsure whether that is true or not. He certainly did write some plays during plague. I mean, there were several lockdowns in Shakespeare's time. It's likely that maybe he did write some of it, or write a fair bit of it, but there's nothing to suggest that he definitely did or definitely didn't. The thing about King Lear that strikes me the most is when you're reading it, is it's a play that focuses a lot on isolation, which is obviously a massive part of what we're all living right now in lockdown, is that isolation from human contact, from friends, from family, which is such an important part of human life. And it's the reason why, you know, a lot of people do break lockdown rules and feel the need to have to see people. It is a basic human need. Belongingness is something that's very natural to us. It's something that we have been, that humans have been bred for. We're herd animals by nature. What is striking about King Lear is the separation of himself from his family. So there aren't really that many scenes that King Lear himself shares with his daughters. When you look at the play, there's actually not that many big ensemble scenes either. There's actually, considering other Shakespeare plays, there's very few. It's limited to small groups of people. And Lear very rarely is on stage with any three of his daughters, either Regan, Goneril, or Cordelia. So it's almost like it's mirroring that type of separation that you have from your family. And the play does feel quite segmented in that, is that you're seeing lots of different storylines happen, and oftentimes the scenes have very, very few people in. Lear himself, you know, he takes himself off into the moors to be a bit dramatic in general, because Lear is very dramatic, but he leans into this mental illness that you could say is linked directly to the fact that he is having no human contact. He is pushing himself into isolation, and that could be linked directly into his madness. Another thing people often say about King Lear is of the tragedies, it's the most tragic of them, because it just doesn't let up. There isn't really any comedy. I mean, it has the Fool, and the Fool probably has about 3 jokes in his entire part. It's mostly there just to, it's a bit of a foil or a bit of a highlight exactly how off the deep end Lear is going. It starts off really tragic, and then it gets worse, and then people lose their eyeballs, and then someone wants to kill themselves, and then it ends on just this senseless death of Cordelia that you think just last minute maybe isn't going to happen, but of course it does, because even at that point when they're like, oh, maybe Cordelia won't die, but the audience at that point is like, no, she's definitely already dead. Like, of course she's dead. And this was a big part of the plague as well, was the it hit the young people more than it hit the elderly. People between, I think it was 10 and 30 were the most vulnerable. And that's the biggest tragedy when you look at plagues like that. It's hitting these young people whose lives have barely begun. It's senseless death. And Cordelia's death feels senseless, as does really Goneril and Regan's. Wait, do they both die? Yes, they both die. Can't remember. It's such a dark play that I forget who dies and who doesn't. But he, you know, his family dies, his youngest daughter dies, who's really done absolutely nothing wrong, and it's just like, why is there all this death? There is no happy ending in it. There's not even any really satisfying resolution. It's just, life is sometimes really awful. That's kind of it. So that I think that reflects quite well what it does feel like living through a time of such uncertainty. It's not really any good news, you know, living through a plague and people are dying, and then eventually you're going to come out of the plague, but those people have already died, and you have to start looking at, what has this shown us about society? What has this shown us about the unfairness of society? What has it shown us about how different people are struggling, and, you know, different death rates are different depending on what area you live in because of poverty. Ethnicity is becoming a big thing. Minority groups are suffering more than certain other groups. Poor children are falling behind more than children from more affluent areas, and it's just unfair. And that unfairness is brought across really well in Lear. There's no resolution, there's no happy ending, it's just tragedy. So yeah, that was kind of my initial thoughts on Lear.
Thank you, Charlotte. I love the way you've made us think about Lear's separation from his family as a kind of driving force in the play. And of course, in a sense, it's kind of self-imposed, isn't it? But not intentionally. And yeah, those scenes where he's traveling around from one daughter to another, trying to find a place of welcome, and indeed even the very moving scene at the end when he's reunited with Cordelia. I think you've sort of made me think about the connectedness of that theme through those scenes by focusing in on that. Can I bring in others as well? Would you like to respond or ask Charlotte a question?
I think it's really interesting to consider the aspect of mental illness in respect to plague. I think especially when we think about pandemics and epidemics in the distant past, especially going back to even like medieval periods, we often forget that mental effects were as prevalent as, of course, the physical damage being done by these diseases. And I think there's this weird framing of mental illness as because the science surrounding it is quite modern. People often think that its very existence is a modern thing, and that it's like no one got depressed before there were psychiatrists, and that's not the case, obviously. And there's often this sort of romanticization, or is that even a word? Romanticism, I suppose, within literature where things are dubbed like madness. There's often this, and there's this sort of romantic element to madness with like these characters like King Lear and figures in sort of like modern early modern literature like Edgar Allan Poe, and how mad he was, when really these individuals are just very, very unwell. And I think it's interesting to analyze the fact that whether it's a physical illness like the plague, or a mental illness like depression or anxiety, or a full-on psychosis as to what King Lear is suffering from by the end of it, these things are always interlinked. That illness is illness, regardless of which part of the body is being attacked.
Yeah, I think they do. Lear's mad, like his madness, whatever it is. I think Shakespeare does mental illness really well, because I think you can make a very good argument that he definitely, I would argue that the evidence is there that he did probably suffer from depression at some point in his life. And I think Lear has done really well because he does have this irrationality about him. The anger at the world and the anger that he turns inwards at himself, the fact that he does want to pull himself away, and he kind of feels like he doesn't have any choice. But there sort of is choices, but sometimes there aren't choices. And yeah, everyone keeps talking about right now, we're going to return to normal, everything's going to return to normality. But the reality is the mental health scars that we are going to carry on from this pandemic aren't going to disappear as soon as social distancing disappears. We're going to have to work on the nation's mental health, which is something that we've never been good at working on, because everybody dismisses mental health as like, oh, we can't afford to, have counsellors in schools. We can't afford to have therapy for everybody. And then they go around like, oh, I wonder why suicide rates are so high. Maybe they're linked. I don't know. I'm not a scientist or anything, but possibly a bit of a cause and effect. This isn't going to disappear. The mental illness issue is only going to get worse if we don't address it. And we need to learn not just about, how to keep ourselves healthy, but how to keep ourselves mentally well at the same time. So I think people are going to be expecting to be like, I feel a bit down in lockdown. As soon as lockdown ends, everything's going to be better. And then they're going to get frustrated that they don't instantly feel better, because that's just not how mental illness and mental health works. So we need to focus on that a lot more as a nation. Whether we do or not, it's going to be something we see. I don't want to place bets, but we'll see.
Well, I think that's something that's really important, and I think we're already starting to see, and I'm sure you'd be seeing this by the work you do in a school. And I'm involved with schools in a school governance role, and I know that schools are already doing an enormous amount of work on that transition back to something like normal, and having to pick up a lot of mental health issues in pupils as part of that process. But I think Lear is kind of famous as a play for, I guess, interpretations of, what causes Lear to do what he does, as being in some way linked with something to do with old age and mental health, like possibly a form of dementia. And of course, that connects brilliantly with what you said about isolation. And we know sadly that there have been so many stories this year, and the frustration of people who've had their relatives in care homes and been unable to visit them. So we know what the effect of that separation has been for many, many people. Yeah. Sarah, did you want to come in on Lear?
I'm very interested in the idea of isolation, and I'll pick it up a little bit when I'm talking about As You Like It, because Shakespeare seems to me to spend a lot of time thinking about what it is like to be separated from your loved ones, or to be banished, to be sent away. And I think that's part of the experience of the people at the time through the plague, and it's certainly the experience of people nowadays. That sense of separation, whether it's self-imposed almost as it is in Lear, although, as you say, he doesn't actually mean it like that, but that's the result of it. I mean, he is like the old parent who gives up all of his money and ends up getting put in a care home by his children, when he thought he would be able to stay at home and be looked after. It's happening every place around us, and it's very, very sad. But you also get, when you think about madness, you always think about Hamlet. He was sent away. He was off at university, and of course comes back, and the whole family situation has changed. And I suppose that links to what you were saying, Charlotte. The idea is you can't necessarily go back to normal when things have happened, so that the whole status quo just doesn't exist anymore. So yes, and the effect on young people, I think, is very powerful. And obviously Lear is the play that deals probably most fully with that parent-child relationship. A lot of the plays do explore it, but and yes, I've been in education for many years, but also talking to my daughter about the effect of it on my grandchildren, even very young grandchildren, who are kind of 2 and 3. That the changes in them, because they don't really understand about lockdown. And she said to me the other day that one of the things that's upset her most is that her children have gone from optimists to pessimists, because whenever she says, we'll do this or we'll do that, they say, well, it might be cancelled, we won't be able to, we can't take our friends with us. And she is worried that it's going to take them a long time to readjust. You get the feeling that sometimes people think, particularly little children, will just bounce back, it'll be fine. But it's deep, and it is going to take a long time for us to restore that sort of sense of security for them, I suppose, when we emerge from this.
Well, let's try and be optimistic about one thing, because I'm sure one thing we're all hoping very much is that when we can put on some plays again, that those will really contribute to people's well-being, because I think we all believe that theatre can do that for people. So let's hope that's can be sooner rather than later. I'm going to suggest we move on to Ciarán, and Ciarán, would you like to introduce us to the play you're going to talk about?
Sorry, the mute button was being funny there. I am going to talk about The Merchant of Venice, kind of in and around the idea of plague and the epidemic outbreaks that surrounded it, from its arrival in at least in Britain in about the 1320s is probably the first time it sort of showed up. But before I go into that, there's just a couple of little things I wanted to add, which I thought were interesting, especially since, John, you're going to be directing Thomas More. And that is that one of the first national proclamations to deal with the spreading of plague in 1518 was officially promulgated by Thomas More. And that was the hanging of straw in front of houses that had the plague, and the carrying of white sticks by people who had been inside plague houses. And I also think it's interesting that in Thomas More's Utopia, he specifies that the society, this utopian society, in the past had to deal with two great outbreaks of plague, which just sort of emphasizes how ubiquitous that it was, that even in Thomas More's perfect society, there was still an outbreak of plague. The first thing I sort of like to touch upon surrounding The Merchant of Venice is the idea of persecution and superstition. And in this, we can very much see that nothing has changed, especially within the outbreaks of persecution towards Asian communities, especially in America. Hashtag stop Asian hate. Seriously, stop it. It's bad. And, you know, these sort of old superstitions that are going around about how 5G towers are spreading COVID, and the rest of it throughout the medieval, the sort of middle and late medieval period, when plague was at its height. There were massacres in Provence, Barcelona, Erfurt, Basel, Aragon, and Flanders, as well as many other places. 2,000 Jewish people were burnt alive on the 14th of February in the Valentine's Day massacre at Strasbourg. And this was all between 1348 and 1351, in the great pandemic, often labeled the Black Death. Around 510 Jewish communities were just completely destroyed in this period. And there were superstitions going around, both the Jewish people were causing the plague, some claiming that they were poisoning wells, and this is how it was going around, as well as superstitions that Jewish people were immune to the plague, which is probably connected to the fact that they were often ghettoized. And so if the plague didn't, the way the plague spreads, which I'll go into a little bit more in the sort of second part of what I wanted to discuss, meant that unless it was brought into a community, it was very unlikely that that community would catch it from person to person contact. It was more surrounding goods, and because these people were ghettoized, often the trade was only amongst their own people, and because of this, some Jewish communities went largely unaffected. And also, there's theories surrounding the fact that there are Jewish religious laws around cleanliness, such as you have to wash your hands before you're allowed to eat bread, and that you have to wash every week before the Sabbath. And that this, in comparison to some of the Christian communities and the unhygienic nature of the way that they went about, meant that it was less likely for these people to catch the plague. And of course, The Merchant of Venice is very much a story about persecution, whether it be the persecution of Shylock or the persecution of Portia. In this scenario, the persecution of the Jewish people surrounding Shylock is more pertinent, but I just add that in because I think often the kind of the misogyny that is placed on Portia often gets put in the shadows in comparison to the light that people often discuss the anti-Semitism within the play. And As well as these sort of superstitions surrounding the Jewish people, there were all kinds of ridiculous things that were going around. One of the sort of most humorous and also most horrific superstitions that went around was there was an idea that catching syphilis would make you immune to the plague, and so there were individuals who purposely tried to catch syphilis because they thought that it would stop them getting the plague. Because the miasma theory of disease was all the rage from the medieval period all the way into the middle of the 19th century. The idea the plague was being spread by these miasmic evil things in the air, this sort of like evil gas no one could see. The theory that onions could absorb the plague started going around, and the reason that they go black when they rot is because they're absorbing all the black miasma in the air that you can't see. And so one member of parliament during the Great Plague of the 1665 suggested filling an entire ship with onions, sailing it down the Thames so it would absorb all of the miasma in London and stop people getting sick from the plague. And I think that what is really unfortunate is that a lot of this superstition surrounding it got in the way of any real ability to tackle this disease, because the way that it spread was so different to most other endemic diseases of the time, like smallpox or syphilis, for example. Of course, that didn't come until a while later in the, after the Columbian Exchange, but still. And one of the superstitious ways to get rid of it was the release of smokes and gases and things within a house. And there's a recording of a doctor who was paid lots and lots of money by the British government during the Great Plague of 1665 to remove plague from houses, in which he burned sulfur, brimstone, and lots of other things. And this actually seemed to work. But the reason it probably worked is that the fumes were so noxious, it drove out all the rats in the house, which was the real cause. And to sort of bring it back to the Merchant of Venice and Shakespeare, the other thing the Merchant of Venice is very, very much concerned with is trade. It is literally in the title, and it's all about a business transaction. And one of the major plot points of this business transaction is that Antonio's ships, his ventures out in the world, they all get scuttled and lost and destroyed. And this is why he can't pay back Shylock, and thus he tries to take the pound of flesh. And business transactions being scuttled by plague was something that was very, very common, because once people started realizing that it could be spread from one place to another by people traveling around, one of the first things that they would do is not allow boats to allow people off boats traveling from a place that they'd heard plague was. Or there is often plague passports would be given. You'd have to have like a written note from the parish you were from, often from clergy, saying that this person has not been in a house where the pestilence is. What is really interesting, I think, is that the world of Shakespeare and his existence and the art that he created existing was so tied to it. You could argue that it wouldn't exist were it not for trade and suburbanization, which were also the biggest causes of the plague. Studies have shown that the rat flea would rather transport itself within cloth and grain supply than on actual individuals, on humans. And so if it had just been the movement of people themselves, there would have been a lot less transference of the plague than if it was actual trade goods being moved about. And of course, without the trade network, a lot of these texts from ancient Greece, which were coming from the Muslim world, which had not suffered from what was causing the Dark Age and all the rest of it. These ancient Greek texts, which inspired Shakespeare, and these sort of really old stories from Italy and that sort of area, which were inspiring Shakespeare's tales, he wouldn't have had the sort of subjects to write on, and he wouldn't have had the same kind of education that he had. And if it wasn't for the suburbanization of places like London, there wouldn't have been the population to come to so much theatre. And the problem with suburbanization is that often you end up killing a lot of the surrounding wildlife, larger predatory creatures like foxes and wolves and things like that, and leaving the smaller disease-carrying animals that they would be killing. For example, in the 1980s, due to certain suburbanization projects, the white-footed mouse became much more populous than it should be, and thus Lyme disease began to spread throughout the population. And I think it's just interesting that Shylock even mentions it at one point when he's talking about the things that could stop Antonio's trades. He says there are land rats and water rats, and he's saying that as a metaphor for thieves, as he later says, I mean pirates, but literally the travel of rats was probably more inconducive to trade than the travel of the moving of pirates around the world. We know that the plague was only spread by house rats and not field rats. And house rats are not migratory creatures. They only moved with trade vessels in the bows of ships or within large wagons. And so it is basically completely our fault, really, that these epidemics kept happening. And that the growing of the world that sort of Shakespeare lived within, from the sort of medieval period when the Black Death happened, up to Shakespeare and beyond, to like the Great Plague of 1665, which probably killed more people than any other epidemic in England to that point. There's a lot of data that suggests that the Black Death didn't kill nearly as many people as is often said, for reasons I won't go into because I realize I'm taking up a lot of time anyway. But my main point is that it's these urban centers, and these sort of cultural festivals like plays and markets and things like that, which really caused the plague. And one last thing that I will mention to answer your question, John, when you wonder why there isn't a play that is specifically about the plague, I think it's because it's so ubiquitous that we often think of the plague as like the Black Death and then maybe like some of the plagues during Shakespeare's time, but this was something that was happening like every 20 years, if not less. Throughout Europe there would be outbreaks of the plague. It was at the point where a lot of people believed that it happened every time a king died. It was just something God did to wash away the sins of the previous reign. And I think it was so ubiquitous and so commonplace that I'm not sure if people really needed a play focusing on it. Everybody had experienced this. Everybody had lived through it. And I think it's something that hasn't really stopped. We look at COVID now, and obviously it's horrific for us, but there was SARS in 2003, H1N1 in 2009, a series of Ebola outbreaks around 2014, MERS and Zika in 2015. This is something that keeps happening, and we are not really doing much to prevent it. And yeah, I'm going to stop talking now because I've probably been going on for a long time.
Well, thanks, Ciarán. There's so many different things in what you've said. I don't think I'll get that image of the onions going down the Thames out of my head for a long time. But kind of more seriously, I think that ubiquitousness is in evidence in Shakespeare in some ways through things like the way in which the plague is used as a kind of an everyday curse. And actually, one thing I did look up was which play uses the word plague, or which plays use the word plague more than any others. And the answer is the Henry IV plays, because Falstaff uses it as a curse repeatedly. And you could start to say something very clever like well, actually, his Falstaff and his values are kind of plague on the country that Hal eventually has to eradicate. But the simpler way of looking at it, I think, connects with what you just said, that the plague is so much everywhere that it's an offhand curse for him.
It's only ever mentioned once in Merchant of Venice.
Yeah.
Shylock says, "I'll plague him," in reference to Antonio. Then the only other mention of disease is in the had the do not I speech where he says suffer from the same diseases. And I think that's very interesting that because of the persecution of the Jewish people surrounding plagues, the only character in it that mentions plagues or diseases at all is Shylock, and both in the sense that he is a plague and that he suffers from the same plagues as everybody else, which I think is interesting.
Well, that connects with other things he tries to say about his humanity, isn't it? That he's like, we are all the same. But I think your point about plague, being one of the things that, in terms of anti-Semitism, that Jewish people have been blamed for, and almost that would have been kind of automatically understood by Shakespeare's audience. And so maybe there isn't a reason to kind of state that explicitly, is a very powerful point to make about how it is, implied in that hatred that the plague is one of the potential causes of that hatred. So thank you. Charlotte, Sarah, would you like to come in?
Do have a thing. So when you said, Ciarán, about how the plagues are caused by us, and then that's true in terms that we're the problem, because we invariably just do stupid stuff that causes plagues. But what's interesting is we're also the solution, is we know how to deal with pandemics. 10 years ago, most countries had pandemic plans that they decided, we don't need to spend money on those, we'll just cut them. We need to find deficit money, so we'll just cut our pandemic plans. And everyone always says it's never an if with a pandemic, it's always a when, because that's how viruses work and bacteria works. We know that it's always around the corner. Thing is, because politics moves so fast, that could be the next government's problem. So it's almost like, I don't care, because we look so short-sightedly to this. And I think something you see in Shakespeare's plays a lot is powerful people arguing about absolute nonsense whilst individuals suffer because they're arguing about nonsense. And because we polarized everything, because everything is polarized right now, so the issue of pandemic protection became a big polarization point. It became that with Donald Trump, when he was like, oh, our government dealt with it the best. No one was even thinking about pandemics till we came across, trying to score political points. I saw Johnson decided to have a pop at Sadiq Khan over TfL, saying absolute lies, by the way, in the middle of a pandemic briefing. And it's like, this isn't the time for political jibes. We're in the middle of people dying. But that's something that's always been, trade comes above human life. Housing comes above human life. Everything, because the idea is, populations replenish, but I could start myself a legacy that's going to last forever. So something that you do notice on Shakespeare is just powerful people consistently putting other things above human life, and that's something that we see in this country alone, but all over the world. And that's why we had 3 lockdowns when New Zealand had 1 lockdown, because New Zealand decided that let's try and protect the people, and our government decided let's try and protect the economy. And funnily enough, New Zealand has a good economy and a healthy population, and we have neither. So
Thank you, Charlotte, and go New Zealand.
Yeah, go collectivism.
Yeah, I think probably we ought to move on, Sarah, if that's okay with you. So could I ask you to move on to your play?
Yes, indeed. And it links quite well, actually, because I've chosen to look at As You Like It as an example of one of the plays of Shakespeare that draws on the pastoral tradition. And so it does link directly with what Ciarán was saying about urbanization and density of population within the cities and within the towns and the suburbs, being a place where disease is going to thrive. I mean, the pastoral tradition in literature goes way back. You know, we're back in classical literature. We're back with Virgil and his eclogues. And you know, it's not the only play in Shakespeare, of course, As You Like It, that takes us off out of the court or out of the city into the country. We've got Midsummer Night's Dream, The Love's Labour's Lost, Winter's Tale, for that matter, where we end up in Bohemia, and of course The Tempest, about as far away from civilization as you could possibly be. I'm not suggesting that Shakespeare uses this pastoral tradition just because of plague, but it does fit quite well with the idea of distancing oneself from the city and the court. As You Like It, again, with many of Shakespeare's plays, we don't know exactly when it was written, we don't know exactly the performance details, but we're pretty sure that it was performed in 1603, which was one of the years that the London theatres were closed, and Shakespeare and his players had to go out into the countryside, go and visit small towns like Ipswich and what have you, and they ended up at Wilton House down in Wiltshire, and we're pretty sure there was a production of it there. Wilton House is actually quite important for Renaissance literature because the Sidney family were associated with it, and they wrote lots of pastoral things as well. Without going into too much detail, I mean, the pastoral tradition, you know, what is a pastoral piece of literature? Well, basically there are sheep in it and shepherds, but it's set in the countryside, and there is something quite restorative about being in the countryside, a place where, yes, there's bad weather, and yes, the life is tough, but it's a simple life, and you can see nature and the cycles in nature, and that in and of itself kind of restores you, gives you a perspective, distances you, as you know, Charlotte, you were talking about, you know, the kind of petty politics and the distractions rather than seeing the big picture. And I think As You Like It helps us to see the big picture when everybody goes off into the forest of Arden. I think, you know, a lot of what we hear about in terms of how are people coping during our lockdowns is going out into the garden, if they've got a garden. You know, there's been a huge boom in people planting things, you know, enjoying nature, trying to get out and see nature. And I'm sure the same, you know, applies in Shakespeare's time, when the cities were bleak and the urban centres were the place where disease was rife. If you could get away from it, and of course some people could, others of course not, you know, there was a simple life, and a life that was more healthy, and a life that perhaps gave a better perspective and a sense of hope, that yes, could restore and be something quite positive. I'm trying to be quite the positive one here in terms of how Shakespeare responded to plague and how those around him did. I mean, there are references to the golden world, and you've got the court of the Duke, who's been banished, another isolated character. He's been banished, separated from his family, but he's out there in nature and enjoying it. And he's finding, how does he put it? He talks about the finding tongues in trees and books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. And he contrasts that with the kind of corruption of the court, and corruption and disease is often associated with the life of the political life of the court in lots of Shakespeare's plays. And he refers to Robin Hood and says, you know, everybody's going to live with the Duke out in the countryside, like in the old legend. And so there's that kind of harking back to a simpler time, a healthier time, a time of you know, natural existence, rather than the urban life that so many people, that Shakespeare's audience would have found themselves in. So there's a kind of nostalgia there. And I think, again, there's a huge amount of nostalgia in our society at the moment for, times, better times, times when we could go, and sit in the garden, times we could go to the beach, times we could go on holiday. And so there's a hankering for that. But there's also a recognition that, there are cycles of life. Things live, things die. We've got the 7 ages of man. We're born, but there is a pattern to things. But I think all of that is really quite reassuring, that you're seeing, any current situation from the perspective of that kind of bigger picture. So, yeah, I mean, there are various references in the play to obviously to the countryside and what it does, but also interestingly, Jaques, who's the character who gives us the 7 ages of man, he talks about saying he will through and through cleanse the foul body of the infected world if they will patently receive my medicine, which I think is very interesting. So the idea that actually if you listen to somebody who has got philosophy and a kind of rational commentary on life, it will actually improve people and they will get better. They will emerge from their infected ways of thinking. Jaques is a very interesting character, of course, because he's melancholy. He doesn't really fit in. He's not part of the happy ending at the end of the play. So he's the philosopher. But he is also enchanted by what he finds out in nature, and he's loyal to the Duke. And I think that the play is about loyalty. It's about finding what are your priorities, and again, to me, that relates very clearly to what people are doing at the moment. We've already talked about how difficult it will be to kind of come back from this, and that the status quo won't necessarily be the same. But I think that sense of priorities, that sense of the simplicity of life, the importance of looking after the elderly. I mean, my goodness, we've got old Adam in the play. It's very telling that at the end of the 7 ages of man, where you end up with old age, sans teeth, sans everything, and then in walks Adam, and he is old, but he is still valued. And he's valuable. He's helped Orlando. He's helped Orlando to escape. He's warned him that he's in danger. He's gone out into the forest with him, and that kind of loyalty from the old generation to the younger generation, and vice versa, with Orlando looking after Adam in a way that Lear's daughters certainly don't look after him. So the sense of priorities, the sense of loyalty, family, and that escape into nature, which you could argue, for some people has been a bit kind of superficial during lockdowns. People, kind of having a go at planting a tomato and getting something out of it, but actually it is simple things like that really are helpful, and put things in perspective. So for me, it's As You Like It, and the other pastoral plays as well, that give us that sense that perhaps Shakespeare's exploring how we can get away from the places where the infection is, and actually, recognize the joy that there can be, and the health that there can be far away from the city and the corrupt court. So that's really what I wanted to contribute in terms of As You Like It. I'd be very interested if you've got any ideas about it.
Thank you, Sarah. I think one of the things I found myself thinking about most as you were talking was the whole thing about Jaques, and you mentioned the end of the play, and of course there is a bit of a sense at the end of the play of everyone except him going back to their normal lives, and therefore presumably going back to the city in one way or another. And I guess that feels a bit like kind of where we are now, when we're talking about, some people actually feeling very anxious about returning to what we previously regarded as normality. but it would seem to me that whenever Shakespeare explores these kinds of alternative lifestyles in the kinds of places that you've talked about, there is usually at least some call to go back and face what the realities are, with, but hopefully taking some new learning with that. I mean,
absolutely. I mean, you get this at the end of Love's Labour's Lost is a very good example, where you've got they've been out in the countryside, and you've got the three women and the three men, and they've all been wooed, and it all seems very light. And then right at the end of the play, sorry, spoiler alert for those of you who don't know it, but the princess's father has died, and news comes, and then the whole tone has to change, because they have to go back, she has to go back, and Barone, her wooer, wants to pursue their romance, and she says no, we can't do this, and tells him to go off, and actually tells him to go off to a hospital and tell jokes there, and trying to get people to laugh there for a year before she'll even consider getting back together with him, which is very chilling, actually. And you've got that lovely line where she says, do something for a 12-month and a day, and then they say, well, that's too long for a play. And you're back to reality. And at the end of The Tempest as well, of course, you've got to go back, been on the island, but you've got to go back. Midsummer Night's Dream, they all have to go back, as you say, and that is where we are at the moment.
Thank you. Charlotte or Ciarán, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I had a couple of things I wanted to say. I thought it was very poignant when you said of those who could afford to get away, because that was a very, very big part of it. The bubonic plague especially was considered a disease of the poor, because of the way that it spread. Not only were people able to get out of cities and urban areas to escape the spread, but living within stone houses made a very, very big difference to whether you'd get the plague, because for bubonic plague to spread to people, first it has to ravage the rat population to the point where the fleas become blocked with the bacteria, and then go into this ravenous hunger where they will bite anything, and that's when they start biting people. And if you don't have a large population of rats in your house, it's very unlikely that you'll get bubonic plague at all. And interestingly that you mentioned 1603, the Proclamation of 1603 in London specifically attributed the epidemic of that year to the pestering of excessive numbers of idle, indigent, dissolute, and dangerous persons in small and strait rooms and habitations. And so literally blamed the poor for why the disease was going around, like why it even happened. And yeah, I think it's very pertinent that the individuals who are in the woods already is a court in itself. And it's in these situations, it is almost always the poorest people who suffer the most. Sorry, I realized that your little speech was trying to lift us up, and I've just brought us back down.
Well, I guess in a way we've been talking throughout about what the learning is, haven't we, from these experiences, whether it's what the characters learn in Shakespeare's plays or whether it's what we're learning now. And perhaps the most positive thing about all of this is to try to make sure that we genuinely do learn. That connects with what Charlotte was saying about having proper pandemic policies and things in place. So it's about political things, but it's also about what we actually value in our lives and how we choose to live them, and what we find most important in terms of our relationships and our experiences. So that seems totally positive to me as something to take from all of this. Charlotte, did you want to come in on anything Sarah had to say?
Not particularly, but yeah, I do think it's quite telling how optimistic we are as a bit of a nation. Every time we think, I think we all kind of did buy it a little bit last year when it was like 12 weeks, then it'll be fine. We'll go back to normal. And we're becoming a bit more pessimistic, but you can see, you know, everybody right now is like, oh, 12th, everything's going to go almost back to normal. And we're all kind of believing it because you kind of have to see the brighter side and believe in a brighter side. And I guess that's the what man always is like. They always want to you have to see a brighter future, because otherwise how can you live with the present if you can't imagine there's going to be something better? Which isn't, I guess, a weakness, but it kind of is a little bit, because, you know, sometimes you have to fight for that better future. But you know, it is quite nice to see when you see people making plans, even if you think it might not actually happen. People are endlessly optimistic. There's always somewhere you can draw optimism from, and I think, you know, it's nice to. It was probably a relief for people in Shakespeare's time to go and see a farcical play about people running away in the woods and finding themselves, and then at the end, all the corruption that seemed like a really big point in the first like 5 minutes of the play, and then you kind of don't talk about it anymore, is kind of magically solved. And that's quite nice. That, oh yay, it's done, everyone's happy apart from Jacques, but that's okay because he was a bit weird.
Thanks, Charlotte. Okay, I'm going to go on now to talk a bit about Measure for Measure. And I hadn't expected the 1603 proclamation to kind of come up so much, because it is directly relevant to Measure for Measure, as you'll see. And indeed, the whole business about crowded urban locations, but more about that a little bit later on. I chose Measure for Measure because I read a couple of things, including something by the Shakespeare scholar Emma Smith, in which she argues that the two plays that she sees as being most influenced by the plague are Othello and Measure for Measure, which she believes were written in the big 1603 theatre closure period that we've talked about. And her argument about Iago, to be honest, I haven't read the detail of it, but I didn't like her headline statement about it, because she talks about Iago as a kind of super spreader, and it seems to me that isn't the right analogy for Iago, because his malevolence is so kind of pointedly targeted. So it feels to me he's more like Novichok or something, you know, sort of attacking one individual in a very aggressive way. So I thought, not sure about that. So I'll have a look at Measure for Measure. And while I was thinking about this today, I was very struck by the news item today about an Amnesty International report, which has come out about how governments have been responding to the pandemic, that mention two things that are totally on message as far as Measure for Measure. The first is about how governments have been taking additional powers for themselves and acting more strictly with the powers that they already had. And the second is about how some governments have been manipulating and controlling information to achieve the effects that they want to achieve. So it's quite a critical report that Amnesty have come out with today. And when you look at Measure for Measure as a problem play, and about how the leaders in Vienna are dealing with the situation that they are, those two issues are immediately there. And first of all, it's very clearly Angelo's strict interpretation of the law that leads to Claudio's death sentence for getting his fiancée pregnant. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff in the play about the fact that at the time, okay, strictly speaking, he wasn't married, but nevertheless had gone through processes in terms of preparation for marriage that would have meant that a kind of much more common view would have been that, you know, if you get your girlfriend pregnant at that stage, it's not actually an issue that ought to suggest that you get executed for that. So there's that taking of power in Angelo, but also when the Duke goes about trying to bring about the famous denouement that there is in Act 5 of Measure for Measure, it's very clear that a lot of the time he gets the point that he wants to get to by withholding information from various people, and some of that withholding of information has been sort of repeatedly worried over by critics trying to find some kind of explanation of it. The most famous one is when he fails to tell Isabella that in fact her brother hasn't been executed, when there's really no good reason why he shouldn't tell her at all in terms of what's going on in the relationships in the play. The only grounds he has for doing that are to manipulate the situation to contribute to the denouement that he wants. So you immediately have two leaders who are behaving with the same kind of limitations that Amnesty are attributing to governments now. And we've seen those concerns expressed, haven't we, in the anti-lockdown protests. There have been in many countries, probably the discussion now about vaccine passports. And today, people complaining both about the infringement of civil liberties and the lack of, quite often there have been complaints about the lack of clear information from government about what's going to happen next. And today, there's been discussion about that in relation to the international travel thing not being clear, and so it goes on. So then when you look into a bit more of the historical context, Measure for Measure was first performed for James I in 1604 on Boxing Day, and James I was, of course, the new king. And some critics have read the portrait of the Duke as a kind of flattering portrayal of what James I might be seen as a kind of moderate ruler who would combine justice and mercy appropriately in his reign. And that was actually the theme of his coronation sermon. So it was clearly an issue that was kind of very live as this new king came to power. What's he going to be like? Everybody wanted to know. What's interesting then is to say, what's the connection with that issue, which was a real one at the time, with the plague? Well, in Act 1, Scene 2, so very early in the play, Shakespeare introduces the pox as the illness that's affecting Vienna, and that happens through characters like Mistress Overdone and Pompey. And they make it clear that there's an epidemic of sexually transmitted disease in Vienna. But the connection to London and the plague is that in that scene, the character Pompey announces, did I know we were going to be talking about suburbs tonight? All houses in the suburbs of Vienna must be plucked down. And that's regarded as a reference to the 1603 proclamation that's been mentioned, part of which in relation to the dissolute behavior of the poor that has been covered, is specifically about demolishing the houses in the area where all the brothels were and all the prostitutes lived. So what was really going on in that proclamation? Was it about getting rid of the plague? Was it about blaming the poor? Was it about using the plague as an opportunity to take other kinds of action that are limiting social interaction? And that was the real objective of the government. So it seems very unlikely that an audience in Shakespeare's time wouldn't have immediately seen the pox in Vienna as being a parallel that was being created to the plague in London. What's more about James I is that James himself was very like the Duke when the Duke, as you will know, decides to make himself absent and not deal with the problems in the city himself, arguing that a more strict approach is needed and he's not the person who can do that. Well, James himself, he came to the throne just as there was this outbreak of the plague. He took ages to get to London, which caused a lot of criticism initially. But then even when he got to London, as soon as the plague started up, he took the court out into the country and did a kind of endless progress, which actually didn't do much good because they got the plague even in the court when it was out of London. But there's the same sense of an absent ruler leaving other people to get on with solving the problems. Then there's the issue about kind of peremptory justice and Angelo making this decision to have Claudio executed. And it can be argued that James was a bit like that himself, because he, even traveling down to London, he personally sentenced a thief to death in Newark. And it's a very famous case because it's the last time that the royal prerogative was used in England to execute somebody. And even the bits in the play where people are not given all the information, like, you know, they're not told the truth about who's dead and who's still alive, or they're threatened with execution. James did that himself. There was a thing called the Bye conspiracy, where which was regarded as which was a plot against James, although probably not a very serious one. And in the outcome of that, James actually sent people to the scaffold, knowing that he was going to reprieve them, and they didn't know that was going to happen. And there were some people who he gave a reprieve, but still told we're going to be executed later, by telling them that he was having mercy on their souls by allowing them to prepare themselves spiritually. Now, what happens in Measure for Measure? The character Barnardine, who's in prison and is due to be executed, very comic, well, probably the funniest scene in the play, actually this guy refuses to be executed. And the reason he gives for refusing to be executed is that he needs to prepare himself spiritually. So it's very difficult to believe that the Jacobean audience wouldn't have seen some real tensions around the whole management of the plague and about James's behavior as a new monarch, as being the context in which the play is set. So having brought James in as a new king, that obviously gives me the opportunity to talk about Boris Johnson, which I'm sure you'll all be pleased to hear, because after all, Boris became Prime Minister and is our new national leader just as all this happens. And what have we been doing? Just like the people in 1603 were sitting there arguing about what kind of leader James was going to be, and watching two, I would argue, in the Duke and Angelo, failing leaders in Measure for Measure. We've been spending our time discussing Boris's libertarian credentials and his supposed belief in, the freedom of the individual being set against the strict regime of rules that he's chosen to impose on society. Now, I'm not talking about the rights and the wrongs of that, but it just struck me as it's another example of the real management of plague being reflected in the real management of coronavirus in 2020-21. One last thing, because I couldn't finish without talking about Dominic Cummings. Of course, why Angelo is despised eventually is because he imposes strict rules and is then shown to be a complete hypocrite. For those of you, anyone watching who doesn't know the plot of the play, having sentenced a guy to death for having sex outside of marriage, he then attempts to sexually force himself in effect on a woman who wants to be a nun, and it exploits his power to do that, which is actually far worse than what Claudio, the man he's going to execute, has done. And as Claudio himself puts it, he says, has he affections in him that thus can make him bite the law by the nose when he would enforce it? Well, biting the law on the nose is mocking the law. And, you know, if that isn't Dominic Cummings and Barnard Castle, I don't know what is. So my view, having kind of looked into this, and it's helped me to understand Measure for Measure a lot more, to think about it like this, is that it's absolutely kind of on message about these issues of how to manage a pandemic, what leadership in times of crisis is like, and that being combined also with people thinking about new leaders and how they are tested by such circumstances. So thank you. And anyone like to come back on that? Sarah.
I was going to say, I think it's fascinating, and those parallels, which I certainly didn't know about before, but a more general point about leadership, because I mean, certainly I think before the pandemic, before all of this, you know, obviously we wanted to know what was going on in the government, and we were interested in who was prime minister and what have you. But suddenly, you know, leadership is so important in these times of crisis, and people are looking to their leaders. And, you know, we're looking around the world at world leaders in a way that we really don't usually, I think. You know, Charlotte's already mentioned New Zealand. You know, we're looking at good leaders and bad leaders, and it's something that Shakespeare is constantly exploring in his plays, particularly in the history plays, but not exclusively. You know, what does make a good leader? Why do people follow these people? And, you know, I suppose in a rather naive way, I thought, well, that's quite historical. You know, back in the day, that's the way that they looked at their leaders. But we're having to do it too, and we are holding them to account, looking at their kind of moral compass, if you like, and also, as you say, you know, to what extent they are leading us effectively, to what extent they're abusing their power. Johnson, Trump, you know, we're looking at Macron, we're looking at what's going on in Brazil, we're looking all over the place and seeing, really examining, scrutinizing our leaders in a way that perhaps we haven't done for a very long time.
Yeah, I think it's made them feel a lot closer, hasn't it, in a way, you know, and it's the, and I guess specifically because it, you know, it feels so direct in terms of life and death issues. And I think we've probably all felt that today, even with the, you know, the latest discussions about the AstraZeneca jab. And, you know, are we being told the whole truth about that, you know, which comes back to that issue about managing information, and are we convinced that the advice is right? I don't want to put anyone off from taking a jab, because like the rest of us, I'm sure, you know, I think that's really important, but nevertheless it makes you question these things about leadership in a way that you feel such an immediate personal connection to every decision that's made at the moment. Yeah. Charlotte, Ciarán, would you like to come in?
Well, yeah. Oh, Charlotte, do you want to go first?
Yeah, you can go first.
You sure?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. I just a few quick things. Firstly, I think it's interesting that you mentioned preparing yourself spiritually for death, because this was something that was obviously really important to people. It still is to a lot of people, but it's not as prevalent or ubiquitous. This is a word that we've used a lot as it was back then. And one of the terrifying things about bubonic plague was how quickly it killed people, and because of how many people were dying, often people didn't have time to receive last rites and things like that, and people were being buried in mass graves. And so it was this sort of like double death of physical and spiritual death. the Bishop of Leicester during 1348 put out a proclamation basically that people were to be absolved as normal on their deathbed except for debtors, which I think is just really, really horrific as a way to mitigate how many people who they were allowed to go to. Another thing, you bring up James I, and I'm not sure how relevant this is, but I have to mention it. That James I was wildly superstitious. He was terrified of witches, and the witch trials and the persecution of women under and of pagan folklore and stuff was never as bad as it was under James I. He wrote an entire book on witchcraft and what was going on. He also once got lost in a storm in his ship and blamed it on witches, which led to a trial that occurred in the palace where he personally inspected 3 women that he then executed, blaming the storm on them. And he's also the only English monarch to ever execute a male member of the aristocracy for witchcraft, whose bones, I can't remember his name, and I don't want to go rummaging through my history books, but I remember the tidbit that he then had the bones of this individual cut up and sent to different abbeys and abbeys and churches across the country as relics of, like, we have a bone of a male aristocrat witch, like this is what we're doing to bring them down. So yeah, James I was a bit of a maniac, and I think that it doesn't get played up enough. People often focus on like Elizabeth and Mary burning Protestants and Catholics, but James thought witches were coming to get him, and that's way worse. And on the sort of this spiritual focus, something else that happened through these epidemics was the kind of near collapse of church rule, because obviously priests and monks and other members of the clergy, both lay and professionally trained members of the clergy, were dying of the plague almost as much as everybody else. The control the church had was becoming more limited, and also because they had no power to stop it and people thought that they should. And so there were a lot of not sanctioned preachers on street corners talking about how it was the end times, or that the plague was being sent by God, which lent the idea that if you survived the plague, it meant that God didn't think you were a sinner regardless of the life you'd lived before. And so there were lots of acts that were put forward, like the Conventicle Act, which gave the church and the government power to restrict, capture and move around religious dissidents, which ended up with a lot of people dying. For example, a group of Quakers were rounded up in the 1650s during the epidemic that was occurring then, and over 100 of them died both in Newgate jail, and then about 30 of them died on a ship when they were put on a ship to be transported, but then the ship couldn't move because of the plague, and so they were on the ship for 7 months, and they died of the plague on the ship. I think that very much leads into what you're talking about with political and forces of power, and how they change the rules, or there's the twofold, sorry, I'm getting mixed up in my words, but the twofold of people using this as a chance to gain more power, and then people panicking that the systems are collapsing due to the crisis, and rambling around trying to find a way to hold on to the power that's slipping through their fingers. And again, like what we've discussed, nothing has seemed to have changed really.
Charlotte, do you want to comment at all?
I just kind of quickly, I'll try not to go on a bit of a political rant, but you never know with me.
We'll see.
The big thing on Measure for Measure, I don't know the play hugely well, but the big thing that always struck me is the Duke seems like a bit of just a knob in general. Like, he goes away and leaves this corrupt person who, let's face it, it's clear within 2 minutes that he's corrupt and probably the last person you should have left in charge. And then he's like, I will now solve this problem. Sure, the problem you created, well done. I guess you get brownie points for doing that and then forcing a woman to marry you, whatever. But he just feels like he's trying to pass the buck. He's continually trying to be like, none of this is my fault. It was this guy. you know, the one I left in power, which is a big thing that's happening now. Obviously, we see it in every government that is not handling the crisis well, isn't handling it well because they're refusing to take any responsibility that they are the problem. And this started quite early on in the pandemic. I mean, if you look at initial reports, it was being called like the China virus. That then feeds into the really anti-Asian sentiment that is bleeding into society. It's always been there, and it's one of the forms of racism that's really overlooked massively. Obviously, in America, there was those Chinese massage therapists, or who was killed by that young boy, 8 of them, and everyone was like, oh, I think the police officer in charge said, oh yeah, that guy had a really bad day. And I'm like, I'm sure he didn't have as bad a day as the people he shot, but sure. It was easy to blame China as well, because governments wanted an excuse to try and take their power down a bit. And then it just feeds into this whole racist sentiment that also plays very well for certain voters and certain systems. So what you see in Measure for Measure of people just continually being like, this isn't really my fault, this is because of somebody else, is just something that's still happening today. And you get the image, I always get the idea that Shakespeare just got really annoyed at it, got really annoyed at people who would continually not take responsibility for the stuff that they did. You see it in Macbeth. You know, Macbeth spends about most of the play feeling guilty, but also being like, oh, what a terrible predicament I've suddenly found myself in, as if he didn't have any hand in anything that had happened or anything that is happening to him, or, you know, the children that he had murdered or that kind of thing. And yeah, it just seems like a lot of Shakespeare's plays, people in power never want to take responsibility and always think they're the victims. And we see Claudio, but it makes sense there would have been other people that actually did get executed for pointless crimes that we didn't see, because they're not main parts in the play. But I mean, Angelo probably had loads of people killed, and you don't see the Duke really apologizing for that or the problems that he himself caused. And I just think it's quite a nice parallel to what we still have. You know, governments asking, why is poverty so bad? Poverty's so bad because you made it bad. You can't complain about the system if you are the system. You can just change it. Stop doing the bad things you're doing, and the problems will sort itself out. But yeah, anyway, I'm going to stop talking about politics now.
Well, I
Sorry,
think it's absolutely fine, because I mean it's clearly absolutely relevant, and that tension between the personal and the political is something that I think's figured in what's been said about all 4 plays tonight, but also in you know, the parts of the conversation where we've talked more about our experience of the COVID-19 now. Okay, now I think probably we've explored all we've got time to do, because we've gone on longer than we intended to at the beginning. And I'll just say to the audience that I hope that you didn't switch off at the point when Ciarán said, I'll answer your question, John, just by saying the plague's ubiquitous, because I hope some of the stuff we've said kind of beyond that has kind of elaborated on that answer. But I think it's come out as a kind of underpinning, actually, that I think what we've shared has suggested that the plague is there in Shakespeare a lot more than it might appear to be, and some of that would have been in the shared knowledge that Shakespeare as playwright and the performers and the audience had about its ubiquitousness. So some of that probably doesn't need to be stated, but there was also the telling point that somebody made about, you know, the question is not if a pandemic is going to come, but when it's going to come. And the need for societies to get better at planning for pandemics and dealing with them, and clearly with that, if that is something that we've learnt from this experience as a world. It's probably a really important lesson. And I think also what's come across for me has been that point about if we're looking for the positives, it is about taking those spaces to find what in life is really important, and to make sure that we learn from finding out what we individually and as a society really think that is. And that's what we mustn't lose sight of as hopefully we continue to come out of this pandemic. So I started by saying perhaps this should be called the bard pursued by the plague. Perhaps what we've actually talked about a bit is the bard sort of turning around and facing the plague, and a recognition that for a mature society that's something we need to do, and that Shakespeare clearly did in many ways in his plays. So I'm going to suggest we wind it up there, and I'd just like to finish by thanking Charlotte, Ciarán and Sarah for a conversation that I've both enjoyed but found in moments moving as well, when we've talked about some of the really deep effects that coronavirus has had on our own lives and other people's. And I hope that you've found it interesting.